It's on biodiversity. So we talked a little bit about genetic biodiversity and species biodiversity and why those are important. Now we're going to talk about functional biodiversity or diversity, right? So there are 24 different ecosystem services or functions, and out of those 15 have been found in decline. So what are we seeing declining? We're seeing a decline in pollinators, the ability to filter drinking water, lumber, food supplies, and nutrient cycling. So these, once again, why are these important? We depend upon these. If we don't have the ecosystem, if we're not working together on this functionality, these things are too expensive to replace. We'll never be able to do it as well as the natural world does it. And so to preserve these things means that we're working with the natural world. And I cannot emphasize this enough. I don't think that we as Americans truly understand this concept. How much we depend upon the natural world to work for us, especially when we live in cities. Now, that's not a problem to live in a city or a suburb, because the closer we can clump people together, though it increases the population density, what it does is it can help unfold the natural world for us. So I've touted this before, but Nature's Best Hope talks about how as a community, as homeowners, we have a responsibility to help preserve these ecosystem functions. And we can use our own yards to be able to do these very things, to provide for the natural world so that the natural world provides for us. Okay. So what is causing the loss of biodiversity? And I gave you HIPCO. Let's just kind of go through this real quick. Habitat loss. So this is where we just basically destroy habitats. A good example is one that the wetlands down here, Florida. So in order to grow things, and also there's this idea of draining the swamp. Y'all, the swamp is where it's at, man. We don't drain the swamp. We keep the swamp intact because of all of the things that it provides for us. Not just biodiversity, but the functionality of a wetland is so important. And so what we've had to do is we've actually had to pull back and look at what we have destroyed and try to find a way to recreate it or to build it back up. So habitat loss, we discover the more we tear things down, the more harm we do to ourselves. Shrinking habitats. Now this one, where they become islands, and this one is really important when we look at our susceptibility to diseases. So one of the, and when I say diseases, I mean novel diseases, new ones. This is called zoonosis. And zoonosis is when you have a disease jump from an animal to humans. So that's disease jumps from animal to human. This is becoming more and more common. So one of them is coronavirus. It jumped, right? Now it went through a vector to get to us, but essentially we picked this up from bats. Another one is Ebola, SARS, MERS, AIDS. All of those diseases at one time came from our interaction with animals. Because once we shrink down their habitats or we start to encroach in those areas, then we have more ability to come into contact with those. In fact, the H1N1 that attacked the Spanish flu was actually because of our contact with bats in Kansas. They call it the Spanish flu, and that's a total misnomer. Not happening. Here's the reason why this is a problem especially with diseases or any sort of thing, right? So let's say that like here you had your habitat, right? So you had your whole habitat. Notice what happens is that you can come around the edges of it, right? So you have this kind of contact with it. But what happens when we break this into chunks? So let's say, oh, that didn't work the way I wanted, but that's okay. Let's say we start to break it into chunks like this. Now what we've done is essentially increased our surface area, right? So now our contact comes in this way. So we have these shrinking habitats. It also causes fragmentation. Now, rather than there being one whole ecosystem, we now have it broken into different little pieces. And those different pieces, they don't interact because we're now in the way, right? We've gotten in the way between these little chunks. So if you look around Flower Mound, for example, we have wooded areas, but the problem is that they're cut through with highways. Or roadways. They have housing subdivisions around them, and it's very difficult for wildlife to be able to move from one place to the other without coming in contact with us. So this is a problem. Alien species. All right, so we have our native species. Those are the ones that naturally live in the area. They belong here. And then we have exotics. These are ones that are brought in, and they don't usually cause any sort of trouble, right? They're just seen as a novelty, right? But the problem is that sometimes these exotics can get away from us. And when they do, if they don't have competition, they can become invasive. So invasives usually lack competition. So they don't have any of the controls that they would normally have, right? So they don't have a predator after them. They don't have a disease that can attack them. They love the situation in which they find themselves, and they do very, very well. So well, in fact, they begin to take out the natives. And invasive species are a huge, huge problem. But people didn't bring them in for that reason. They brought them in because they thought it would help. So first period, someone did one on buffalo grass. And buffalo grass was actually brought in as an erosion control. So we started to see land washing away. So they planted this fast-growing buffalo grass, and then it took over. One that is a big one in North Texas is Bermuda. Now, Bermuda grass is a highly, highly invasive species, and we have embraced it and we love it. The problem is, in order to get it to grow in our lawns the way we want, we have to give it lots and lots of water and lots of fertilizer. And then it has that rippling effect, right? So we're going to now have problems along the way. So how do invasive species cause loss in biodiversity? They begin to take over for the natural native species that are there. How are they introduced? Well, they're introduced because we bring them in for our own thinking that we're doing the natural world a favor. Sometimes they brought them in to be hunted. So the nutria, which is loose in all over the South, that little nutria looks like a little what's that thing called? Beaver. But it's not. It doesn't have the function of a beaver. They brought it in to hunt the thing. So they liked it over in Europe where it had controls, but now they brought it over here where it has no controls and it has gotten out of control. Sometimes things happen through accidents. So the lionfish or the angelfish in Florida got loose from pet stores and from owners when the hurricanes came in. Hurricane Andrew came in and destroyed people's aquariums, and then the fish got out, and now it's taken over. Sometimes people will release animals that they no longer wanted as pets, and this has happened with things like pythons and boas in Florida as well. Florida is a hotbed for invasive species. because of the climate, right? And so they're doing very, very well. And they actually have now hunts to try to bring in as many of these large pythons and boas and anacondas and all these South American and African snakes that people thought they wanted as pets, but now they decided they didn't want it. The red slider turtle is another one where people thought, oh, this will be a good pet to have. No, terrible, terrible. All right. Over harvesting. So there are lots and lots of examples. One is whales. All right. So we've hunted the whales down because we wanted the oil. Interestingly enough, whales have actually been saved in many ways because of fossil fuels. So because we started no longer needing whale blubber for oil, the whales no longer needed to be harvested, and so we replaced them with fossil fuels. Did we do any favors? I don't know. It's hard to say. Okay, so the plant and animal trade actually has made over-harvesting problematic. So if you think back to, and my friend is going to talk about this, that when we set something aside as being an endangered species or whatever, all of a sudden people want to collect that, right? That becomes the cachet. They want to have whatever it is because it's seen as rare, right, and more valuable. So what they've tried to do is figure out, how do we approach this problem of moving species back and forth, right? So there's several things. One is the Lacey Act. And that you need to know what each one of these control, all right? The red list is endangered species. And then the CITES Act has to do with how we move these things around. The Lacey Act is the trading of animals and plants. Okay. Pollution. So the BP oil spill has had a devastating effect, and we'll talk more about that later. And then, of course, climate change. If we don't have enough time for things to adapt, they have no other response but to die. All right. So these are just some questions for you to think about. Why is it complicated? All right. What are we doing about it? And what are some ways in which we can problem solve? And these are big, big problems that we have to ask ourselves. Are we able to do it? So there are a couple of approaches to conservation. One is the focus on single species. So this is the Endangered Species Act that I've been talking about. Essentially what we do is we say, okay, let's protect this one thing. All right. Now, the thing is that in order to protect it, we have to protect the environment that is around it. So it kind of goes hand in hand. That was the hope. But what has come about is the list where people now suddenly want these endangered animals and whatever because they suddenly think that they're more valuable. So it can be problematic. Another thing is that we have a tendency to concentrate on things that we think are more beautiful than others. And so this can be a problem. So the Convention on Biodiversity, this would be a good thing for you to know. So why don't you just look that up? So you need to know all three of those, know them, memorize them. So here's something I want you to pay attention to. Notice what is the most vulnerable. All right, plants. This goes back to habitat loss, right? The more we go in and just cut things down, we are threatening them more than anything else. Well, once we threaten the plants, all bets are off, right? This needs to, we focus on these big ones down here. We focus on these guys. But what we need to be focusing on are the ones of the small guys, the little guys, the basis of the food. All right, so the littles, they need our attention as much as anything else because They're the most threatened. They're the most endangered. So here's ecological extinction and what it looks like. So you'll notice that usually they're tracking these different kinds of animals and species, and then as they see the size collapse, there'll be where they're watching it very closely, right? And they're trying to protect it. Captive breeding. So there have been a few examples where captive breeding did some good. Things like zoos. And I know there's a lot of controversy out there about how you feel about it, but many people believe that captive breeding is one of the ways in which we're going to be able to save some of these different species. All right, the other approach is on entire ecosystems. All right, so this is how do we look at the bigger picture. And why is this important? It is important because of functionality, right? So it's not just about saving species, it's about saving the function of the ecosystem as a whole, the things that we can actually derive from that ecosystem. Challenges are that those ecosystems usually are in competition with our other needs, and we'll talk about this with land use in our next 2 units from now. So biosphere reserves are essentially what we do with national parks. All right, so a national park is an attempt to preserve a biosphere. So what they do on this is they essentially create a ringed approach, and you can see this in the textbook in chapter 18. So essentially you have 3 to 4 rings like this. And what this outer ring is most contact by humans. So if you ever go out to Yellowstone, what you're going to see is that the road is ringed. There is a road that goes all the way around the outside edge of Yellowstone, and there are about 4 portals or entries to Yellowstone itself. So you can drive in and you can get on the road and you stay on this road. This next ring is where you're going to have limited access. All right, so you're going to have very limited access in this second ring right here. These are going to be things like your backpack camping. All right, so you don't drive in. If you want to camp in an RV, you're going to have to do it out here on this outer ring. This inner ring is going to be where you're going to backpack in. There's hiking trails and those kinds of things. So there's some limited approach to this. I think I put it in the wrong ring. And then finally, this inner ring is no contact, no humans. And the hope there is that we preserve something for the rest of the animals that are there. Now, one of the challenges with this is that people want to see certain things, right? They want to see buffalo. They want to see bears. And if you've ever been on a bear, got stuck in a bear traffic jam in Yellowstone, it can be a little bit maddening. Like everybody wants to get out and go see the bear or buffalo. And this is where people get into problems because one of the things that we've done when we remove ourselves from the natural world, we begin to not appreciate it for what it is, right? For being wild. So people think, oh, that poor little buffalo baby sitting out there by himself. I'm just going to pick him up and I'm going to move him. No, leave him alone. Mom will be there if you'll just leave him alone. But a lot of people don't really understand how that works. So anyway, we can talk about that more later. Okay, so that is all that I have for you on biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity. So remember, this is chapter 6 and chapter 18. I don't have enough fingers. Bye.